And we move forward. Page 18. Go on to the second paragraph of the page, right above the modern word bourgeoisie. Within the vortex of these disturbances, long-distance trade declined drastically. In England, the export of wool and cloth, and subsequently their production fell well below 13th century levels. In France, or Gascony, there's no France, the export of wine was similarly affected. Hay remarks that, quote, Florentine bankruptcies in the first half of the 14th century were paralleled by similar troubles in Florence at the end of the 15th century, while P. Ramsey notes that the precipitous fall of, quote, the great merchant bankers of southern Germany. At this time, as Jeremiah has noted, what's more powerful, the state or cities? Cities. Florence. You see. When he says France, he got, in parentheses, Gascony. Meaning what? The state hasn't yet emerged as sufficiently muscle. The old bourgeoisie is tied to these islands. Let's continue. Further north, the Hansa League disintegrated, while to the west, the Flemish cloth industry collapsed. Finally, even the northern Italian city-states found their bourgeoisie in decline. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, at first disruptive to the Italian merchant houses, would dictate new accommodations to Islam and commerce. There you see the beginnings of what we have now with Osama bin Laden. Islam versus Christianity ain't about a clash of ideologies, it's about two world systems. The Ottoman Empire and the rise of Islam presented a problem to the emergence of the European world system. It's still slugging it out. And as far as the Muslims are concerned, damn it ain't over. So when people say, hey, you're trying to destroy our way of life, oh, how true it may be, but not for the reasons they hype it. Nationalism can't get you in. When Osama bin Laden tells his people, look, I remember before those Europeans crawled out the cave. In fact, we the ones talking about to read and write again. Go look at the history of the Moors. It's true. And this has been a painful interruption in the rise and extension of Islam. What? European civilization. But it's almost over. That's why you say these people are crazy. Hold on. Before you call anybody crazy, you gotta look at the context under which they're talking. Because if you look at it, you got fundamentalists on both sides. The Taliban on this, on one side, and George Bush and his crew on the other side. Because nationalism does that.
You say those things go back to what we were discussing earlier about the economy being the decisive factor and everything else is just kind of a side thing?
Yes, the economy, primary factor. But then culture also blends in. It's not as simple as poor or rich, but it's not as simple as Islam versus Christian. It's all very complex, and the context extends. That's right. That's exactly right. Now let's continue. He says what? The rise of the Ottoman Empire first disrupted to the Italian merchant houses to dictate new accommodations to Islamic commerce, eventually persuading some of the Italians to relocate as capitalist colonists of what? In what? The Iberian Peninsula. The Italians began to relocate in the Iberian Peninsula. And what is the Iberian Peninsula? Spain. Spain. And Portugal. Both of which he calls later in the book, largely their beginnings, metaphors. But they ain't where you learned it in elementary school. The Spanish, as Christopher Columbus, ain't no such thing as the Spanish. You got Ferdinand Isabella trying to put together a state on the fly with finance capital. They go to Lisbon, they go a few other places, and they get this war from who's not from either of those places, Columbus. But is this told now? It's the history of states and countries and empires. No. That's not how it was on the ground. Let's continue. He says what? For the moment, however, the foundations of European civilization, still figuratively embryonic, appear to be what? Crumbling. Now goes what Jay is raising, the modern world bourgeoisie. The modern world bourgeoisie, not the older one. He says what? Henri Perrin, however, provided the key to one of the mysteries of the emergence of the modern era of the 16th century from the chaos and desperation of the 14th and 15th centuries. The quote, survival of the bourgeoisie. Perrin also anticipated the somewhat rhetorical question put by K.G. Davies in the heat of the debate revolving around the historical authenticity of the phrase, the rise of the middle class. Davis queried, what after all is wrong? Suggesting that the bourgeoisie, not steadily but by fits and starts, improved its status over many centuries. A process that began with the appearance of towns and has not yet been finally consummated. Meaning what? What's wrong with looking at how they came out? In not in a steady march, but in fits and starts. 40 years earlier, Perrin had already replied, I believe that for each period into which our economic history may be divided, there is a distinct and separate class of capitalists. There's the root. They're separate. In other words, the group of capitalists of each of a given epoch does not spring from the capitalist group of the preceding effort. At every change in economic organization, we find a breach of continuity. It is as if the capitalists who have up to then been active recognize that they are incapable of adapting themselves to conditions which they are evoked by needs hitherto unknown and which call for methods hitherto unemployed. We're never in a moment like that now, but if you think about the difference between what? The Jay-Z's and the Rockefellers, you can trick out that name, but Jay-Z don't look like John Rockefeller. In fact, is he? No, Jay-Z is more like in the petty bourgeoisie. He's still in the manager class, trying to get into ownership. What's his commodity? Is it oil? What is Jay-Z selling? I sold crack, I figured I could sell CDs. I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman. Yeah, no, you're a petty bourgeois, man. My money like mine lasts 3 lifetimes. Really, how many lifetimes is Rockefeller on? Only 3? Yeah, diamonds are forever. Not this. If your intellectual capital was not the capital of the 19th century, hard capital was. In other words, intellectual capital may be the capitalism of the 21st century. So it may very well be that he is dealing in the thing that will make him part of the new bourgeoisie. We don't know yet, because the conditions that created it didn't exist before.
Did you be safe to say that the separation between the first bourgeoisie classes
Yes.
and the modern bourgeoisie
Yes.
would you say that the modern delineation in part is due to the process of information?
Oh no!
In terms of Europe?
Clearly. Here we go. Good example. What we talked about earlier. The idea that what we take as commonplace now resulted from a moment when the decisions that were made could have been economic, may not have been. The printing press, what we attribute to Gutenberg, after creating numbers and letters, and movable, not maybe movable type in the same way, but the point is this. The idea of portable literacy in the form of books and the way that they were printed revolutionized everything. What? Because if you could read, you could move into that manager class very quickly. The conditions make it very different. Now, those of us who are not literate in the forms of literacy that now predominate run the risk of being made irrelevant. I don't do all that. What's that tweeting? You know what? You're going to be like the person who before Gutenberg, all that writing, all that stuff down, and you carrying this stuff around. I got mine here. Next thing you know, you can't get a job. Why? Because if you can't do this, you don't roll. You can't do this, you don't roll. Now it's what? Y'all can organize now. Something goes down. If something gonna go down now at 6 o'clock, everybody on campus can know about it, except us. Meaning what? This is a problem. The shifts in literacy are still very fluid. And at given moments, we don't know whether this is one of those ages, but we are clear that every moment that comes will generate its own internal class relations, and that they don't necessarily overarch over large ethics. Everybody follow me? Marx then, explaining class conflict is important. Black radicalism is too, but both of them come out of particular historical conditions. Yes.
The church probably was the most unifying factors.
Yes.
Even beyond white supremacy and
yes.
concept, it was probably the most unifying factor in Europe. If you think that the fact that modern world kind of seems to be a little more, not only organized, but separate.
You mean in terms of what? Ideas?
Ideology and motivation.
Oh, no, absolutely. But motivation, let's take this for example. Because Jay, really, the question that you put on the table, we still haven't got to, which is how the new bourgeoisie emerged. We have to wait till Tuesday to continue that conversation. We'll talk about the content. But here's the thing, as it relates to what you said, James. This idea, let's take a classic example. Secularization speaks to a cultural position. The church, in part 1, plays a primary role. Why? What state does the church belong to? The church belongs to itself. It's its own state. The Catholic Church transcends state lines. So even with the rise of the state, the church is still very powerful. Remember, it is the church to which many of these emerging European nation states look to for direction. Spain and Portugal are fighting over the slave trade. The Pope tried to settle it in the mid-15th century with the papal bulls, because the church still has authority. That is what prompts in part England and Henry VIII to start the Anglican Church. No, because y'all got to knock the old people's minds. And through that, England is able to supersede in some ways and circumvent in other ways the rise of Europe and the way that it was going, because they're not Catholic anymore. You know your history of England, you understand they were Catholic initially.